process of being done, I could kind of tell.
You're like, we're almost there.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for coming. Good to see you. So
Yeah, good to see you.
You're not just going.
I was gonna talk about it, but Lauren did just out. She was gonna tell me the second floor. Yeah, I think we're gonna rotate from like math to a class.
But I know that's true, but this one guy had.
Sure will. Or Tyler did.
Yeah, thanks again for joining us by phone. Still there, we're gonna get started in about a minute.
All right.
Well, actually, can you change the setting? You probably will.
I've got 5:30 PM, we're all okay to go?
I got 5:30.
No, seems to get my. All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It is Monday, August 14th, 5:30 PM, and this is a meeting of the School Board of West Joint School District Number 1. More than 24 hours prior to the meeting, notice of the time, place, date, and subject matter of this meeting was posted at the entrance doors of the Education Service Center and at the West Bend Community Memorial Library. A copy was also sent to the Daily News, WIBD, Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and other media sources that have requested notice of our meetings. I'll just pause and ask Superintendent Wimmer to confirm that this meeting was properly posted.
Yes, it was.
Great, thank you. Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We recognize a quorum of our board. We have 6 members physically present, and Dr. Temez is dialed in and participating by phone. Just for the record, Dr. Temez, if you could indicate that you're there.
I am.
Fantastic. With that, we will next consider approval of our agenda. I should also mention that because Dr. Temez is attending virtually, we'll take our votes by roll call. So I've got my roll call sheet ready. I would just ask my fellow board members to remind me or throw some object at me if I forget to call a vote by roll. But I think I've got it remembered right now. So approval of our agenda. It was published in advance. Are there any questions regarding the agenda? Hearing none, I would move to approve this agenda. Is there a second?
Second.
Kelly, thank you for the second. Motion and second to approve the agenda. Any final discussion? Hearing none, I will call the roll. Ms. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Donaldson?
Yes.
Dr. Temez?
Yes.
And Mr. Rebholz?
Yes.
Mr. Swigert votes yes. Ms. Kruger?
Yes.
And Ms. Ergod?
Yes.
Thank you. That motion passes unanimously, and our agenda is approved. We move next to public participation. I have not received any public participation comment cards this evening. I'll just pause. Doesn't look like there are any out there. All right. We will move then to our next agenda item, which is the consent agenda. And on our consent agenda, we have a number of items, including minutes of the July 24th regular board meeting and the executive session. There are 11 contracts included, 2 resignations, no retirements. Then also the Epstein-Ewan Architecture Contract for Services, noted in the agenda that this was approved by the board, and this is the contract that was administratively approved and represents scope and costs as anticipated. And also several continuing contract renewals, which are really software systems support contracts within budget that are utilized in past years and are going to be renewed for this year. Do I have that correct? Superintendent Wimmer? Great. And then also disbursements posted to August 5th, 2023. So a number of items on our consent agenda. I will pause to see if anyone has questions on any of the individual items. Any questions?
I just want to verify, the fee for the contract is set in here at 75,000, is that correct? Is that what I'm seeing?
That's the Epstein-Ewan contract?
Yeah, that's what we were talking about, and that's what's in the budget, okay. I just wanted to verify that that's, I see dollar numbered or hourly wages and stuff like that, and I just want to make sure that that's like a,
That's if we were adding to the scope of what we previously talked about. So you're right, exactly kind of what we set forward. This represents that. If we chose as a board to add something, they're just laying out their fee structures.
so anything that exceeds that amount is coming back to us.
Correct.
Okay.
Anything that would exceed their current scope and that contract amount.
Perfect.
Right, and the contract would come back to us for the amendment and reviewing the amendment as well as the dollars. Good question, John, thank you. Other questions on any of the consent agenda items? Hearing none, I would move to approve this consent agenda. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, John. Melanie, you keep rushing for that button. We'll get you on the next one, I promise. Motion and second to approve the consent agenda. Any final discussion? Hearing none, I will call the roll. Mr. Donaldson?
Yes.
Ms. Lang? Yes. Dr. Temez?
Yes.
Ms. Aragot?
Yes.
Mr. Swigerfolds, yes. Mr. Rebholz?
Yes.
And Ms. Kruger?
Yes.
Thank you. The motion passes unanimously, and so our consent agenda is approved. All right. Next on our agenda is the reports, and we have the superintendent's report. Superintendent Wimmer.
Yes, first things, everyone's noticing just a tweak in the look of the agenda. It's something, I was working with a community member well-versed in agendas, and right now there's no way for board docs, our system, to lay in every individual policy that you would see it. We were saying we need that Goldilocks when you look at the agenda, either maybe a reminder or something to get people like click here for the list. We could add that into that title, or to list them all separately, they would have to appear kind of as this separate item and those separate pieces. So I'm not sure where that sweet spot is. We were saying when you look at board docs, there's a version to print that's called the detailed agenda that certainly gives you that list and those pieces, but you get everything else in detail too, versus a kind of a simple agenda. So it's just something for the board to try and then give us your thoughts, maybe not tonight or in the future, for the board president and I, just as we frame agendas in the future. Just a different look.
So I think with the prior way that we did it, and I'm glad we're exploring a new way, but the prior way was these would all be collapsed, if you will, or contained within one agenda item, but would require a member of the public to click through to see what it all is.
Correct. It would say policies for first reading, and we could add a parens there that says click to see list, and then kind of get that subsequent list. This is the only way to get it in the system to go through, is to make it all these individual items. So it's just a nuance to look at.
And I'll be interested in the board's feedback, and we don't have to get it right now. I, on the one hand, like the detail. On the other hand, I would hate to scare away individuals by thinking this is going to be a 14-hour meeting. So we'll think about it, but I will appreciate feedback from the board, or certainly supply it to the superintendent.
Yep, very minimal feedback. You know, it happened to be someone who's well-versed in board work and all of that, just sharing kind of that thought. So it's not like the masses are coming and saying, oh my goodness, change. You know, I think maybe we could put in parens, click here, or, you know, something that gave a little bit more guidance to how to make it do what you want to see as an end user. And then certainly we were talking about kind of sending that feedback up to board docs itself. So it's just something to think about. If you were around this weekend, you probably saw long lines at Badger and thought, what's going on? It wasn't our event, but it was in partnership with the Chamber of Commerce. So they have a very large, well-known geocaching event right here in West Bend. So we were happy to give them use of Badger. They had an indoor maze that drew 600 people to use the facility just this weekend for that event. Just congratulations to the Chamber, and I know that they work specifically with Felina from our Buildings and Grounds Department, and could not sing her praises enough around working with her to pull off such an amazing event. So just thank you to everyone who helped make a community event successful. Reminder for any parents, we're offering our Jump Starts. Any students who are new to a school, whether they're attending a new elementary school, they're going to Silverbrook, Badger for the first time, registration for those events, they have a mix of day and evening times available, is right on the website. So I would encourage you to check those out. If you have any trouble, give us a call, give the school a call, we'll help you get registered for that. Reminder that freshmen will have a mini day on August 30th from 12 to 3:30. They're going to have a welcome assembly. They go through lunch. They go through different team building, team tours. They get their schedule. And the crew members, there are upperclassmen who serve as mentors and guides, not only with this day, but throughout the year, and especially those first couple days. You can see them in purple shirts on campus, a blending of the two schools, if you will, where they're there for assistance. Anyone can go to them. So that'll be a great event to welcome all of our freshmen. And just a reminder, the countdown's on. I know those of you who are staff are looking at your calendars. They're coming back August 29th to professional development, time in their classrooms to get ready, and eager for the anticipation of students. That first day is for kindergarten through 12th grade is September 5th. Our smaller students in early learning start Monday, September 11th. So those days are going to be here before you know it. We were talking about school shopping, photo days, when you can drop off supplies. Nancy put out in our district communications a great kind of back-to-school checklist for our families, updated the website, so check that out. We were reading in kind of educational news today when we think of one of the things that we do is put amazing people in front of kids every day. So with that, we're still hiring a few positions. But I was really thankful. I'm knocking on some wood. Green Bay had an article where they're short well over 100 certified staff positions coming into the school year. So when we talk about it in Wisconsin and the nation, there is a teacher shortage. However, locally, we have 5 open positions. Interviews are occurring this week. It's just a mix. I think there's 3 special education positions, 2 classroom positions. So that's kind of the status. You see a lot of contracts that you just approved tonight. Teams are coming together. But we're still actively hiring nutrition workers, instructional special education aides, athletic coaches, other positions. You can go right onto our website and learn more about those positions. We also partner with Teachers on Call, which is a substitute service. So they have some really, if you're looking for flexibility in a career, they help you. You might not be in education as your primary field, but someone with a 4-year degree can receive a substitute license. They do some onboarding, some training, as do we. But they provide a really flexible schedule. You can dictate when you want to work, where you want to work. That might be an option for many out there who are listening. As well as Go Right Way, hiring bus and van drivers for the school year. So again, while I look at kind of stories from other districts, happy to just have 5 left for us this year, but certainly anyone, if you're listening from afar, check with your local school district. There's some amazing opportunities that offer a great deal of different educational backgrounds, different flexibility. So check it out, and check out our website certainly for those positions. I have nothing more for my report.
Great. Any questions for the superintendent? You touched just very basically on bus drivers, and I've heard some news stories in other states actually of severe shortages in the bus driver area. Have you heard anything from our vendor?
We're
One way or the other?
finalizing, we're tweaking, they're really looking at routes, they're routing their students right now, looking at those route times, how we could be efficient, and we'll put out some additional communication to families. So while they're staffed, it's gonna be lean. They're certainly not overstaffed by any stretch, but again, our routes are covered. We're always looking for flexibility, though, when people kind of call in sick, how they can kind of deepen their own pool. But one thing that would help our routes run efficiently, we have so many families. We ask you to kind of let us know if you don't need daily transportation, because we could shorten route lengths, because we have to stop whether there's a child on the bus or not, because we just don't know. But so many of our families, if you're able to make that commitment and you're not going to use it, just let us know so that we can work on some of that efficiency too. But yes, we're staffed for our regular routes, but I've heard stories where in kind of the end of last year when other states they pulled in the National Guard to support driving buses. I mean, it got that bad in some areas. So again, thankful for where we're at in our staffing, but I know it could always kind of have a deeper pool.
Thank you. Other questions? Thank you for your report. We move to discussion items, and our first is Head Start carryover request. And we welcome Jamie Mulsum, our Head Start Director, to the podium to walk us through this item. Good evening.
Hi, good evening. I bring forward tonight a very routine Head Start carryover request for discussion. A very brief overview that I can share with you is in the 22-23 school year, we had funds unobligated in 3 categories due to fewer bus routes, the late hire of 2 support staff members, and also kind of the prioritization of one-time dollars that had a fast expiring deadline coming. So If approved, the funds will be utilized in the same three categories in accordance with the performance standards from the Office of Head Start.
Thank you. Any questions on this item?
I just had one question.
June?
If it's not approved, then the money is just lost, and then we just
Exactly.
move on. Okay.
Yes, and I should mention as well, the Washington County Head Start has two governing bodies, you guys being one of them, and also the Washington County Head Start Policy Council, which this has already been approved by them as well.
And you mentioned in your right, these are unobligated funds that would be carrying over from one period to the other.
Yes.
Okay. So this is a discussion item, so we won't be taking action tonight, but we do this for public awareness. We'll see this, I'm sure, on the agenda then for the next meeting, correct?
Exactly.
Any other questions from the board? All right. And I think you have the next item as well, the Head Start Strategic Plan updates.
I sure do. So back in March, Policy Council and the school board, you guys approved our program strategic plan. In April, it was accepted by the Office of Head Start as well as our budget for the upcoming school year. Since then, there have been minor revisions made to the program's goals in order to kind of streamline and separate some of that language a little bit. Anytime we make a revision to an already approved document, the Office of Head Start requires approval again by the governing boards.
Any questions on this topic? Once again, as a discussion item, we won't take action, but I'm assuming we'll see this again next time. June,
Yep.
she's pointing at you, so I'm betting you have a question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I was looking through the goals and also the objectives and action steps to attain those goals. How confident are you in obtaining those goals? Because they seem pretty lofty, but I don't have a ton of background on it. Are we shooting for the stars? Hopefully, we'll get halfway there and it'll be an improvement, or are we confident that these are attainable goals?
I don't like to toot our own horn over here, but I feel very confident that we will come really close, if not exceed the goals that we have. So next year, the 23-24 school year is the first year in a 5-year grant cycle. So we're looking to achieve those goals by the end of that 5th year. Thank you.
Other questions from the board? Again, we'll see this at our next meeting as an action item. We appreciate the preview.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. Our next discussion item is book reconsideration recommendation. Superintendent Wimmer.
Yeah. So both the curriculum committee, the policy committee have been working on this. The full board's been engaged in conversation on not just these reconsiderations that we received, but also just a larger context of instructional resources. So I wanted to update you on a couple pieces where we were. So when we think about not just the 3 books, the couple books in question, it was the 57 bus and the Kite Runner, which were commingled at the middle and the high schools. We've been talking about the selection of resources, the policies associated with those, and we've got to do some deeper work. We have some iterations of some steps forward, but we're certainly not done. And then once we have some of those, we talked as a curriculum committee prior that those other resources like the book club books, those kinds of things would come back to that committee under that lens to really look through those before they're moved into our schools. And then we're also faced with the reconsideration piece with a process that hadn't been utilized for over 10 years and some lingering policy language and guidance on that. So I've reached out and started scheduling those debriefings with people who participated in that process to make recommendations based on their experience, what that looks like. I think revisions are needed there. But I want to make sure and talk with those participants regarding their perspectives too. So we've got all that work in play. And then in the middle of that work kind of being in play, we also talked about these 3 books under reconsideration. So Tim Harder convened reconsideration committees, 3 of them formally. One was to consider the removal of the 57 bus at Badger. They convened, they made a recommendation to keep that. That's used as a book club book on that. There was a reconsideration committee around the 57 bus for a book club book as well as removal of the library at the high school level. And then there was a third committee that looked at the kite runner, both for any book club book or the library as well. So the work of those committees all recommended that they remain as currently used, and that's the recommendation of the committee. Those committee recommendations come to me for review on those pieces. Also, while I was in the process of review, I've also received an appeal to each of those decisions. So we have both my review and that appeal to consider. So going through, I have my recommendations to the board, so I'd like to discuss those tonight so that we can go through and then take it from there. I think a lot of the work is commingled with the work that we're doing as a full board, and I kind of speak to that. But in relation to the reconsiderations, I would recommend that we remove the 57 book as a book club selection at Badger. Not even looking at content, not even looking at kind of those pieces, it's duplicated. It's a piece in curriculum that's dually stated, that was not present in the library at Badger. It's just not necessary in that as a book club. So I would recommend removal there, and again, not adding it to the library. I would recommend, and these are my recommendations as the superintendent reviewing, looking at the context of curriculum. You know, the board still needs to have a conversation if they have further direction for me. I would suspend the use of the 57 bus and the kite runner as book club selections until the curriculum committee is convened. We've got a board work session that's coming up in the future, but we made a commitment as a curriculum committee to pull in those book lists before they went into our classrooms to look at through the lens. And while we haven't kind of set in policy where that target is, right, for profanity, sexual content, all those things, we talked about a general sense, and we also talked about our commitment to making sure those book lists were well balanced before they went into the schools. So I would recommend we suspend that until we as a committee do that work and make a formal recommendation to the board. I think that's really important to deliver on that, and we had started that dialogue before these reconsiderations came. So I just would like to honor that process. And then, in the meantime, I would recommend that we retain the 57 bus and the kite runner in the high school library until we have further board kind of action around what that direction is. Just because if I take these two instances and remove them from a library, I somehow set a bar at that, and now I feel like I might be out of compliance with other books that are selected, that kind of thing. I think we need to just see the work through from the board around where do we want to set that for materials and let that carry forward. If we're looking a little bit into September or something like that till we get that finalized, I would allow those to sit on the shelf until we bring that forward. So these would be my recommendations to the board, but I would be very eager for the board to engage in a discussion regarding it. Again, I'm just looking at it from that piece of we have so many processes and pieces in play. I think we need to see those through and include these pieces in that. So with that, I'm sure the president can kind of help facilitate a discussion with board members.
Sure, so just to recap, so 57 bus at Badger would be,
Remove.
right? And then
Do we want to take
continue
them
on.
maybe one at a time in that or
Sure.
overall?
Why don't we?
However the board, yeah.
Why don't we do
So,
that?
Yep, I would recommend removal of the 57 bus as a book club selection at Badger. It's not present in the library. Again, it may be dually stated in the curriculum. There's other options. I would recommend removal from that piece.
And just also to set the stage for the board, so this is a discussion item, so this is not
Correct.
action, but this is dialogue, and we encourage that. And I saw, Melanie, that you were reaching for your microphone.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I 100% agree with you.
Is there anyone who disagrees or questions that as an action?
The rationale that you used was based on the fact that there's a variety of other literature, correct? Can you just
Correct.
say a little bit more about that?
So it's not present in our school library. So when I back map the process of book choice lists and all of those things, it's unclear kind of how certain titles got there, and did someone see a title and like it. They did some work with literacy specialists from the district as well as former directors, and we had talked as a curriculum committee around bringing that back. We've got all the book lists. We're going to clean up all the kind of descriptions that we've made so parents can see them, but we need to view them first and talk about that. I think there's a wealth of other literature that we can choose at the middle level that really meets the needs, not disrupting curriculum in any way, shape, or form. Again, wasn't present in the library, already kind of further up the chain at a little bit higher developmentally age, that kind of piece. I don't think it's necessary at middle level.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Melanie, I'm assuming that doesn't change your remark. Okay, just wanted to be sure. Kelly?
I'm just, out of curiosity, you said it's not in the library and it was only part of a book club, an optional book club. Do you know the numbers behind how many kids participated and actually read that in the book club?
We surveyed only last spring. I can go back and see if I have other circulation, but it was a very small group because we caught that right as it had ended. And I had given some numbers. I don't want to quote them now, but I can get them for the board for follow-up. It was small numbers, and then we caught it when it was in play at the high school. They may be a little larger, but I'll double check that and get those
Thanks.
numbers.
June?
One question I have is, during the consideration process, were the folks who introduced those books to the curriculum, discuss that topic with you, or just got their input on that particular item?
Yep, so in the consideration process, you talk about, you don't back map some of those pieces. Again, I think the process itself is ripe for some change and some revision. I actually went back and interviewed former directors. So I connected with Laura Jackson, who this kind of started when she was here, and around what that process was and some things that we were putting in play around process. So there wasn't one definitive person who in isolation selected a book, but it was a very small group, and it didn't circle back through curriculum that I saw. So that needs to be corrected.
Other thoughts or comments? Kurt?
Yeah, since day one, hearing a lot of the quotes, I've had a problem with the profanity in the books, just way over the top. And you can argue, is it 1 word, is it 5 words? But I think it's way over the top. You know, I was reading, just let me go for 30 seconds on Mary Tyler Moore show, which I watched, reruns. They say you don't have to swear as a comic to get your point across. So that's my point. Even he was relating past comics to today's comics that go over the top. I mean, so that's my thoughts, that regardless of the content of the book, you don't have to swear to go over the top. And that's my primary objection with both books, that I don't think they should be part of our curriculum. And that's kind of a consistent, since I've heard the multiple readings of the books and glancing at the books, I couldn't read it myself. So that's my thoughts.
Other comments? June?
I've actually been doing some research on swear words in literature, and one of the things I found was the authors feel strongly that it's part of the character development. You know, would this character use those words? And if so, then use the word. So I thought that was very interesting. That was just something that I've recently done research on this topic and felt like that was enlightening to me, because the writers are using the words if they feel that this character would say that word. And so it was it enriches the character as part of the story. So I just wanted to bring that up too.
And to some of that, I think the work of the committee, and we hadn't landed on it in curriculum, but we started kind of talking about that process and that language use. And are you glorifying that, or are you know, is it like, this is unsavory, this is the, you know, what were some of the pieces and the whys behind that, to how do we consider that in the work too? So again, certainly no definitive answer. We just have a lot of work in play and a lot of questions swirling, so.
I just have one comment, and I think I can talk about this here because we were discussing like the committees that reviewed the process, right?
reconsideration
And I know
process, yeah.
that there's talk of kind of cleaning up the way that works, but like to go off of what Kurt had said, like he wouldn't even be able to read that book. And I think I was thinking about that earlier today too. Like the people that are signing up to be on these committees are going to be people that are for the book, because the people that would not want their children reading it wouldn't want to read it either. You know what I mean? And so I think that, I don't know, I just wanted to add that because I think that the people on the committee, everybody was for the book, and they were all people that were interested in the topic, and people that would not be interested in the topic would not probably want to spend their time reading it because.
Well, and we should look at that as a piece kind of in future. So while I'm confident in executing on the process as it was written, I did a lottery, we did it live, it's that. And then I think trying to keep that focus on the books at hand versus that greater scope of every book, which is what the board is grappling with right now, and that's not easy. So I think there's just some good feedback from members who participated in that, and members who were part of calling the book into question. They're included in that process so that we can bring something forward. So I think that'll be a good piece that's needed too. But then in regards to the other books, again, you have then the high school component. So you have both the 57 bus and the kite runner and how they're used at the high school. My recommendation is we suspend the use of those as book club selections. So even though we've already cleaned up how parents will be informed, so all of our parents and guardians are authorizing these books. But in the past, we were providing the list. So we talked about redoing that, making sure we have the information on themes. Is there profanity present? Is there this present? Kind of those pieces, what is present so that they could make an informed decision. Also reiterating what are multiple rating sites, what are some pieces that they could go to as supplementary resources if they wanted to dig a little bit further. But again, I think those need to come right back through the process that we relook at every single one of those books before we launch them into book clubs through the curriculum committee. So again, I would call for that suspension until that comes to the curriculum committee as part of those lists. And we'll be leading with in order because we can't do the entire year for grades 5 through 12 immediately out of the gate. We'll be leading with the ones in quarter one. These will be a little bit further, but we would want to lead before they land in the classroom and get put into circulation. So we might not see those exact ones right away in that first month of the work, but they'll come along.
So that recommendation is to pause or suspend those as selections of the book club until the curriculum
Correct.
committee and board has completed its work.
Correct.
All right? I'll pause there for any questions or thoughts. Any objections to that? Again, we're not taking action, just initial thoughts.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think that's a fair compromise to suspend them until we see if they fall within the scope of what we actually are going to allow to be selected, in the curriculum process. So, I think we're doing a lot of work on that right now, and as soon as that process is complete, we'll actually have a better set of guidelines to decide what's going to be acceptable in a school setting. So I think that's.
Yeah,
And I'd echo those comments, John.
Yeah.
Superintendent Wimmer.
And so again, just kind of, being attention to, it's a much larger process than just these two and making sure we're doing our due diligence and all that. So I appreciate that. And then again, knowing that we have a lot of work in play and a lot of pieces, I would suggest that we retain the 57 bus and the kite runner in the libraries for circulation until that further board work or action is complete. Again, I don't want to be in a position to arbitrarily set a bar and say these two need to be removed from circulation, but I don't have any parameters in which I'm viewing that collection in totality. I think that work needs to be done and they should remain in circulation. We certainly will educate our families on how to view circular materials, how that, again, and we've grappled with this before. That doesn't mean a kid can't pick it up off the shelf and not check it out. Doesn't mean, I can't look at a book, that a friend has, just like I can look at their phone. I can't solve all of that right now, but I think, again, until we have some of these other pieces further down the road, I would be hard-pressed to try and make a singular decision.
So the thought is continue with
They-
process on
yep,
those
they
as well.
stay. Yep, that they would stay as accessible in the high school
Mm-hmm.
library only during that until further action is, or direction is provided.
Remind me about if parents have certain objections to materials in the library, are they able to register those with the library so that individual students, their children may not check them out? How does that work?
Absolutely. So you have either your instructional resources, you have like classroom libraries, you have school libraries. Families can simply connect with either the classroom teacher and or the library media specialist to express that, hey, we're not interested in having books that fall into X, Y, and Z. Can you monitor that? Especially, it's more at the younger age when they're picking some books and just helping guide them towards things. But they can certainly at the high school level talk about that. And then again, you can view what your kids have checked out. So we'll make sure and guide families and again, keep reiterating that so that they know that.
Thoughts? Go ahead, Melanie.
I had a question about the library materials, because are there certain books that maybe have like a parental guidance kind of thing? I know I had mentioned before, like my one son, they had certain materials that were only for this grade level, but is it okay with you if your 7th grader checks out 8th grade books? Or, I didn't know if there were any way that certain books were marked like, hey, this is young adult instead of teen.
So
or...
we actually have some checks and balances on that because seeing some other districts. So in our online catalog system, so I'm thinking of a near neighbor that ran into younger kids accessing, as you said, things that we would deem kind of middle school content. We've got some checks and balances in our system on that, especially.
So Jen talked about that on the ebook side of things. So we belong to a consortium that gives access to it. So we have controls. So if you were 9, 12, you're going to see high school here. You wouldn't see them as a kindergartner or first grader. You see, I think what you're talking about, Melanie, is this idea. I walk in the library, pick off this book right here. When I go to check it out,
Like something
the
pops
library
up and
aide
the librarian's
says,
like,
hey,
oh, nope, your parents said you can't check out
a
this
lot of that
grading book.
happens in elementary because you have such a wide range of grades there. However, that is the same spot that is picked up when you call in as a parent and say, I don't want my kid to read about ghosts because they're struggling with ghosts as kindergartners right now. That little note gets put on there and pops up for that librarian at that time, or they can look at that. So it's not as quite as clear as what you would see in a public library with young adult and all of that, but that's a little more elementary at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Other thoughts? John?
And I'll just reiterate, I think we've talked about it before, but parents do have the option to see what their kids are checking out. I
Absolutely.
mean, I would love to see like a informational part to back to school. Hey, here's how you access all your kids' checked out books in the library so you can keep tabs on it. So we can kind of put some of the onus on the parents to make sure that they're watching what their kids are checking out also. So we don't have upset parents down the road thinking that we let them check out whatever they want, because they should have access to see what their kids are looking at, to make sure they're keeping tabs on the kids also.
We want that, and as we said, we want our parents, guardians to be, in control of that too. Even if there's certain pieces in our curriculum and not just choice books, we always encourage families to connect with us, talk with us. Is there something we need to set aside? Either, again, maybe a student struggling with something specifically, or, a topic that just doesn't align to family beliefs, values, et cetera. Absolutely. So to John's point, I think launching with, how do I express that? What are the avenues? And just keep putting that maybe throughout the year instead of just a back to school, make that an ongoing message that we kind of schedule in.
And maybe to deter some kids from checking out things that they might not be allowed to by their parents, we might want to think about putting together maybe a book report once a quarter to send out, hey, here's your kids' grades, here's also what they checked out in the library. So if there is a discussion that needs to happen, can take place then, or I don't want to say monthly, that seems a little bit granular, but.
I would love if we have so many books on our list that if we had to do it every month for kids, that'd be great. That's a good goal. I'll look into the system
Just a
to see if
thought.
it can push some reminders or do some things proactively as well. I'll check into that for us.
Other thoughts? Feedback for Superintendent Wimmer? I appreciate the discussion and the ideas. And, I know we've expressed different views and opinions on the board, but that's what this process is exactly all about. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate that it's going to come to this point with a recommendation. So we certainly can give you interim feedback as well between now and the next meeting, but otherwise, we'll bring this back next time as an action item.
Yeah. And while our current policy doesn't require that, we, just in kind of everything that's going on, I think it's important for us to formalize that, that piece so that our community sees that, and our families know that, how we're working on their behalf. And then we'll schedule that work session. We'll still keep that work alive in both curriculum and policy, and we'll be talking about policies a little bit further down the agenda too. So I appreciate the board's work as well.
Great, thank you. We move then to policies for first reading, and there are a slate of them.
There are.
So I'm going to turn it over, Superintendent Wimmer, to you and again, maybe we can walk through procedurally. So as first reading, we won't be taking action on these also.
Yep, there's no action, and as we said, we're just trying out some nuances in format, just to check how that might work. So we don't have to act individually on each one of these as written. I'll just kind of flow that discussion as we're ready to move on to the next ones. But this is the work of the policy committee. These were the ones that are kind of ready to move forward based from our discussions. So this is a first reading. 445 is a new policy. We had some of the concepts in 882 around how we work with community partners that just mentioned the police, but it did not dig into the nuances of student interviews with law enforcement, and part of our behavior policy cleanup and all of those, we're recommending this new language. It's in alignment with our agreement with our local police, and they've actually reviewed the language and provided some feedback as well. So we went through those pieces together. So this is what we had discussed, was adding this 445, which is a new policy that speaks to interviews with law enforcement officials or outside agency. Outside agencies could include Child Protective Services, someone who has an interest and has no other access. They always try and access students in other formats, but it does occur sometimes on our doorstep. So this would help guide that.
Questions on this policy? Right, why don't we move to the next one, which I believe is 823, procedure for release.
So the 823, that first one is the current. We would remove that language and fully replace with 6C. So if you click on that next one, that gives you that updated language. So kind of removal of the old. This is getting at a larger concept, which is access to public records. And as parents, you think about it as directory information. I ask you every year, please sign off. And then a board member had a question like, who's asking for that? So largely we see the military will ask for that, or maybe some colleges, because they're, all right, who's your seniors that are getting this to send information for. We'll do some releases for photos. For yearbooks or other publications kind of things, but you get your ask and maintain largely, like I said, military recruitment purposes, those kinds of things. But this is new language from the WASB, and it's clarifying one of our committee things that John really talked about was clarifying the local public office. That's not to be commingled with the elected office. We were saying public office was making people think about elected officials, so we kind of crafted our own language to make sure that people weren't confused about that.
Any questions on those items? I would just say, as a member of the policy committee, I like the newer language. I think it's more very, very specific. You can see the ties into the statutes, and so I think this is a good advancement, but we'll talk about it when we consider it at the second reading. Other thoughts? We'll move then to, I believe that takes us to item D, correct?
Yeah, D and E are a little bit commingled. We could not map back the history on this, so Peggy she's like, well, I'm just putting them twice because they appear once as, it's listed on the website as 832.2 AR, a fee schedule, but when you click on it, it's this lingering 1262, which appears to be some really old policy language, potentially under 1262. So we would recommend removal of those pieces, the 1262, the 832, and just cleanup of that. I don't know why they existed like they do on the website or that, but just to make it clean, we would recommend removal of those to clean that up.
So you're, so just to be sure I understand, so you're talking about removing the language in agenda item D.
Correct. It's the same language that's showing in E, but for some reason it's showing in our website, and I don't want to, we can't map it back to where that action was. If the board ever formally renamed it that, and it exists under that header as well, so we would want to remove both iterations, both as 1262 and as the 832.2 AR. I know I have authorization to remove an AR, but it really looks like some really old policy language to me, and I'd rather do due diligence and remove it
And
correctly.
the understanding would be we would remove D and E because it's actually within
Right.
C
it's-
or B.
Exactly. So you've given
Yeah.
given some updates. We've covered. We're not going uncovered, but it's sitting in these old naming conventions and stuff. So we'd just like to clean that up and make sure we've got it on the books that we formally sunset that policy.
Okay, questions on those items? Why don't we move then to item F, which is policy 841, donated materials.
That was one of my favorites. When you look at 841, it's specifically around accepting hazardous materials. And I don't have any need to take secondhand hazardous materials. So we'd like to just go ahead and remove that completely.
Questions on that item? Let's move to G then, which is policy 1324, community relations, public activities involving school personnel, students, or school facilities.
So again, you're seeing this
Can I-
very, go ahead.
I just
John,
have
go
a-
ahead.
So if, for F, donated materials,
Correct.
if anything was to ever come up and say there's a hazardous material, we don't have a policy on it saying we don't accept it then?
We have donations and other pieces in there, and I shouldn't, through our CFRs,
Right.
our code of, I shouldn't be accepting secondhand open hazardous material. There's other laws and practices that guide me on that.
So you're not concerned down the road, let's say 10 years from now when you're probably retired and the next superintendent doesn't have, why don't we have any policies on donated materials that say,
It sits in some of your other regulations. So you'd have a code of federal regulations that oversee your buildings and grounds and all of that. And you'd have a couple carriers. So it's not just person-specific. You'd also have some other outside agencies who help our district monitor and execute on those expectations. So it's nested in there. But good question.
I don't know if we talked about it at policy committee or I just thought about it now,
Yep.
but
No, it's a good question.
I was just curious. Okay.
Well, and like we said, we always write policy for those who come after us as well, right?
All right. Policy 1324.
So again, 1324 is clearly some old language. Those concepts are now in 850 around those solicitation pieces. So the 850 follows it right behind. So if you want to look at that.
Sure, let's
it's
move to
updated.
850.
So it's just moving those concepts, and it's public solicitations on school premises. And this is really coming into us, that I'm not exposing kids to being solicited for their money or that kind of thing.
So this language in 850 would be, and is new.
Correct. And again, that you have that assurance that you can confidently remove 1324 because it's now, the concepts are in 850.
Any questions on those items? Let's move to 852, distribution of non-school sponsored information.
So looking at 852, we did a review of that, and there's no change. So just for everyone on the board and community. So we might receive non-school sponsored, this is your YMCA basketball leagues, pieces, scouts, all of that comes through, and they would like us to distribute it to our students and families. So that has to come through the superintendent's office. We make sure there's disclaimers on it. We do a double check of the information, that it would meet our intentions, expectations, it's free from error, that kind of thing, before we would allow that to be submitted for people to get distributed to our kids or our families. And then we also might back up and highlight in the community section of our district news that we send out every Wednesday for our families, our community has access. We might be then further highlighting a couple of those things that we receive. So those come through our office. There's nothing broken with the current process, so it meets our needs.
Any questions on that item? So this is a review with no recommended changes, actually.
Correct. So we would just update the review date, so then it would stay on cycle of consistent review.
Hearing no questions, let's move to item J, Policy 860, Visitors to the Schools.
So 860, we have some revisions for you to look at. It's right behind there. So if you look at 860, you have the current language, last updated in 2016. And then we have some updated language for you to review. We did have a lengthy conversation around board member visits. We struck that from here. That's in Policy 161. That guides how and when board members visit. And then we've got that on our next policy committee agenda to dig into that a little bit more. Because sometimes you're going with a parent hat on, sometimes you're going with a board hat on, sometimes you're going just for a visit, so there's different things. So we're gonna bring that back to that committee for that piece, so.
Questions on that item? Hearing none, let's move to Policy 880, Relations with Community Organizations and Governmental Agencies.
So there was a whole slate, and this is sometimes where it's a little bit easier to see them together. So we are recommending change to visitors, or not visitors, the relations with community organizations and governmental agencies as an 880. You have your current 880, and then you have a new 880. And then right behind it is a whole bunch, 881.2, 882, 883. It was like we had a separate policy for every single agency. So we really talked about how to take those concepts, fold them into a new updated 880, and be in attention to those different governmental agencies. And the one thing that we call out really separately in our recommendation for language is keeping law enforcement and our close cooperation there, but also we were talking about different organizations, educational ones, different foundations, those kinds of things. So again, just an umbrella then, which could help us remove some of the ones that follow. I don't need a separate policy for each organization. But we felt strongly about retaining the law enforcement aspect in there.
So any questions on 880?
Yeah.
June, go ahead.
I read through the proposed new 880, and I do recognize that you have law enforcement specifically called out. But then when I got down to 883, that policy was specific for the fire department. And is fire department under the umbrella of law enforcement, or they feel more like an emergency response?
They're an emergency
area?
response
Yeah.
system, so law enforcement, one, they are present and active in our schools. We have a contract with them, we have some other pieces, so that's why we segregated and kept that one a little bit separate. Fire department doesn't really get a choice. If we're calling for 911, they kind of have to work with us. But we also work with them on some pieces around fire safety. They bring all those activities out. So if you'd like the group to consider something for them specifically, but then I'm getting into then do I just have one policy and I list them all separately in here? Where do I?
Yeah, I was just questioning if we're getting rid of 883. We don't really list the firemen anywhere else, but I know, I
Do you want to
feel-
see some language around firefighters?
I understand your question, June. I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, the idea was we called out law enforcement because of the reasons you had talked about. Otherwise, I think the intent was to put more generic languages and then everyone else in the world, so to speak. But I understand your point as I'm looking through this. Maybe we want to take a stab at clarifying that a bit.
Yeah, so if you would like, then I would expand on all governmental agencies, because they are a governmental agency. The firefighters are part of our West Bend, our Jackson, our municipalities that we serve. So we have that. So do we want to add them? Because I would just put in something around, it's more, what makes them unique is, so you're gonna be dealing with EMS services and all those pieces. The only thing that makes that unique is they may, support prevention, education in classes, but I can't hold them to that in policy necessarily. So I can't write that in and say they do this. So I just would wanna do that. But if you wanna see some language around, I would just make it really general. I mean, we're committed to cultivating, maintaining positive relationships with that. I would just, community organizations, and I could put such as, fire departments, that kind of thing, and list them.
You'd have to
Because I have
list-
multiples that
I think you'd have to list out then
Everyone.
everybody,
Yeah.
EMTs and,
Right.
this and that. And I think, I mean, the way it's written to me, it seems like it covers it, local and state government as well as community organization include. And then, like you said, we do have law enforcement in the school, so it seems appropriate to call them out specifically for that well-being of students, staff, safety portion of it. So
Good input. I think what you're saying, June, is we don't want to neglect our first responder and
Right.
fire department friends.
I guess my point was, we're getting rid of a policy that was purposely for the fire department, and is that okay? Do we just leave it at that? Because they're not specifically called out in 880, that's only,
Yeah.
so, wanted to bring that up.
Well, let's
If it's-
go, June, you're not on the policy committee, but this is not required or recommended to have any of those policies. So we're not, as you said, omitting something and having a short-sightedness. And the intention is that they would be considered in governmental agencies. And if that's not clear, choose a reader, we could put that in and give some examples of governmental agencies in there. We could easily do that.
Superintendent, if it's all right with you, maybe you and I can get together and propose some alternatives, and we can bring them back to the board at the second reading.
Yeah, I think you're just looking for that little tweak, right, to kind of expand on the governmental agencies so that we're not feeling left out.
Right, and I just want to confirm it wasn't a miss, but it sounds intentional, but it could be a little more clear, yeah.
I mean, maybe you can just add an extra / first responders.
I was thinking something similar, John, so.
It would kind of cover the basis of EMTs, fire departments, whatever.
Well, and I would double check because, we have a lot of smaller municipalities and townships, and they have volunteer services, that kind of thing, so how we engage. I'll just double check before I make it. Yeah. There you go.
Good. All right.
Thank you.
So Superintendent Wimmer, I think the remaining items then, because those were the ones that are subsumed within, we have
Correct.
no
They-
need for additional discussion
Yep.
currently, unless
Correct. Correct.
anyone wishes to bring up specifically anything in L, M, N, or O, since those are all subsumed within the policy we just talked about, 880. Any questions then on anything else we brought forward for first reading? All right, hearing none, we'll see this for second reading then at the next board meeting.
Perfect, thank you.
We move then to policies for second reading. And Superintendent Wimmer will walk through those. Let's just talk procedurally about this. Policies for second reading, technically with unanimous approval from the board, can be moved, it can be passed if there is unanimous consent, but that is not absolutely necessary. And I know that these
I
are.
have zero recommendation for that. So I would say, no, you're not ready.
No, that's exactly. I was just going to say we could do that.
Yeah.
But there's no absolute need to do that. And I know that these are policies that we've talked about quite a bit. So it might make sense to not do that, but
Right.
we can
Thank
certainly
you.
talk about it as a board. With that, Superintendent Wimmer.
So we've been well-versed in the policies associated with the resource selection, curriculum development. They've gone through curriculum, they've gone through policy, and we talked about taking a step forward. So I'm not going to be shy. You've received community feedback regarding policy language. I've sat down with a member of the community multiple times to kind of go through of where we are and where we need to go, and just honoring, we know we're not there yet. And there's some steps, and then we talked at our last conversation around get a work session to kind of accelerate some of the progress that we're in attention to these pieces plus the practices. So that's kind of where we are with that. That's why, again, no readiness for action, just that continued discussion on these pieces. So just going through kind of conceptually so that we've got good readiness for a board work session and kind of our next steps. Policy, folding in AR, because we've had a lot of conversation around, do we want some parts in AR, some parts in policy, what do we want to see? And then the practices that support. So talked about kind of, and I'm sure Dr. Trueblood will lead this with curriculum as they talk about kind of vision and process. In that very first one, 330, that's really looking at it into, there's the piece for the board to adopt standards, which is, again, locally. So standards, while some foundational pieces can come to us, you still have local control over that. And we talked about the adoption process and the notification. We're required to provide annual notification. The board formally acts on it in their July meeting, so we've got that notification piece in there. And we were talking about maybe developing a visual that grounds us in kind of, so what does that look like? So if I'm just, a layperson, not educational background, like, okay, these are standards and the board approves here, there. What is that? Maybe kind of a visual. Then there's the curricular piece. Then there's instructional units. Then there's the resources. And where's the board kind of action in each step of the way? Because you're approving the adoption of standards. You're approving the curriculum. You're approving any resource selection that's going into the full classroom, that kind of piece. So making sure that we almost create supplementary visuals around the process and then where the board kind of action falls in, so that you're a little bit well-grounded. It's not just the policy language. So that's kind of what we've been talking about and receiving feedback on. What's that next iteration look like on those policies? And that's getting at the guiding ones around standards adoption, notification, and then curriculum development. And then also for the board, an annual piece coming forward through curriculum committee is, so what's the scope of the curriculum work for that year? So if this is our process, right, these are all the phases of reviewing curriculum, where is kind of each curriculum in that phase so the board knows and can see that and monitor that. Now, certain things come up at us. We talked about this in curriculum. CTE area is one of the ones that does this most. We're responding to maybe Marine Park or an industry standard that changes. So they have a little bit quicker cycle. So there's some nuances where we're flexible enough, but we would, again, want to have that, another process piece that goes with it. So what are the phases of that development? Where's the board approval piece? And maybe what's a grounding graphic to help everyone understand that work. Any other pieces as we kind of go through the concepts in the standards adoption notification and the curricular development process? I think those were really big pieces for us to get into that.
So I've appreciated receiving the community feedback. It's great that folks pay attention and share ideas. I like that. I think the idea of the policy committee, at least in bringing these forward, is the acknowledgement that these policies are not done,
Right.
but it advances it down the field. Now, that being said, we've got a work session coming up. We have all sorts of other things in play, and so I don't think we absolutely have to adopt these, but I think we also talked about it would be good to, I think we use the word iterative, kind of iterative development of these policies going forward. So. I certainly would open discussion on that. Again, we don't need to take action on these tonight, as it is a second reading. Other committee thoughts? John?
No, I think I'll just, I guess say, yeah, we talked about the iterative portion of just moving it down the field. I also think it would be kind of a good idea to kind of plan for the board, you know, maybe some of those bigger pieces like selection of resources and stuff, maybe have a breakdown of, you know, potential goals. Hey, next time we meet for this, we're gonna try to get this part knocked out, and then, you know, just to kind of have a timeline for the community and for ourselves, so we can see what we're actually doing and what we're up against, so.
And maybe what some of those artifacts are, right? What are the tangibles and resources that we're going to walk away, not just the policy language, but what are those other supplementary pieces that are going to use to guide our work? So we can get that together, and again, then kind of shore up. What I can do is kind of this feedback tonight is then put together an outline of what that work session could look like. I'll work with Dr. Trueblood, because that intersection of curriculum, the review, we can put that together and send that out to the board members to take a look at and give us feedback prior to coming back again even. To that point then, to the 361, the selection of resources, the other piece, and again, we talked about, we're very nimble at kind of getting in all those supplementary pieces, the ARs around there. If we had a foundation of policy language, we could be fairly nimble per policy. We can put those in quickly to support that, and we can direct that. We can direct that now, we can direct that at the work session, and we can, again, as part of that process, at least get some pieces in play, maybe get it into the AR level, and then fold it into policy as that iterative piece that we were speaking to. But some of those pieces we're fleshing out, so who's responsible for what, when, what's that look like? Some of the same questions we've been grappling with, and how do we set it up in language? And then how do we not, how do we make sure we're defining things, but how do we make sure and not overinflate all the language in those policies so that it's a clean read, if you will? Like, how do we visually kind of chunk that in those stages? So I think getting at and folding in some of those questions we're getting, and some of those questions we think of ourselves as you're seated to kind of have to take action. What is it you need to know? How do you want that to come in front of you? That kind of thing. You're helping kind of frame and shore up the process. Same thing with library media centers. We talked about that piece too. And then the whole concept of reconsideration, and almost at that point, you know, does it become its own policy? And then we went back and forth through committee and policy around having a standard process, right? So our end users aren't grappling with, well, where do I go for this, and is it this? We talked about being an artifact of each one, but are we to the point where we just make that its own policy? You know, of either materials? Because I think it was John last time talked about, you know, if I look twice and I'm restating, you know, we've got that alignment. We always try and keep things. Then I'm having to maintain it in two spots. And I know we just made it the form and everything, but, you know, should we just be moving it to its own policy process? Because again, I think the process itself needs to be cleaned up, not just kind of the form. So we could explore really looking at that as its own policy too. So I think we might be at that stage to consider and work that through at our work session as well. And then library media services and center, and how do we separate that from the instructional pieces, and toying around with formats again for you visually as a board. So what's that intersection, and when do I have to approve every one of these pieces, and what's the kind of checks and balances? What's the process of what that goes through, and how does that get vetted? Because I think we've all inherited some pieces that we look at and wonder, well, how did that arrive, and what's that process, and how did that shift maybe from one person to the next? How do we lay out a stronger foundation of what that looks like for our staff, and for ourselves, and for our community? So that's kind of where we are on those pieces. Was there any language, you know, you've been taking some time, it's just an open piece for all of our board members to give feedback around any one of these policies so that we can help kind of frame those next steps.
I don't know if it goes in the policy, but I guess I am kind of curious, you know, once we have, let's say, obviously, we're going over these because we have concerns in the community and concerns with I think the board and some of us, you know, voicing opinions and concerns with some of the selection that we have already. Mm-hmm. So we're going over this to kind of set a new standard. So once we initiate that new standard, where and when do we actually review what we currently have to, you know, get it up to our standards that we are currently setting?
Good points. We'll make sure and get that in there, and you might have to phase the adoption even more. Again,
Yeah.
that's why we're comfortable with kind of what's going forward, but we might have to, as we get into that work session, what are kind of those rounds of work?
I'm assuming we'll have to look at books and selection of, you know, curriculum portions. And, you know, I think there's been less concern of what's in the younger grades because it's not at those levels of, you know, where it starts to get a bit controversial with student ages and, you know, just what level their minds are able to be at right now. I think, you know, I mean, in my opinion, the younger grades are a little bit simpler because it's pretty innocent, hopefully. But it seems like the most of it's come from Badger and up, so.
And maybe that's where we start and work backwards on some of those pieces, knowing that, looking for those things. And then we can also talk through, you know, how do you start something midstream and what does that really look like? One piece that's going to be really helpful is kind of launching the new curricular website that they're working on, where we've standardized all the formats of the things so you can look at, and even just culling the book list from grades 5 through 12 and what that looks like and how to reframe those. That standardization is really helpful too. So we'll be kind of rolling that out through curriculum committee, but I think that's going to be a really good resource for our families and community to kind of get big picture and then drill down deep to see those things that are of interest. But good point around kind of how do we start it.
I think in the implementation. Yeah, otherwise it's tricky. Sometimes you change policies and, well, wait a minute, we've got to.
It doesn't happen overnight.
Right, exactly. So that's a good point.
But I do think, even though, yes, I agree, it can't happen overnight, that we have too much in the district to do that. You know, it's just not feasible. But I do think there should be, you know, maybe another iterative kind of timeline of, hey, our goal is to have this done by this time, at least certain grades or certain types of books that, you know, I don't know how you do that, pick certain books out of there, but, you know, maybe we can do grade by grade and have a timeline for it.
And we knew kind of going in, we had set a standard in our conversations at curriculum committee that before we launch book groups, we're going to be reviewing all those lists, getting that information, balancing those, and getting those before they launch this year. So that we know is going on throughout the year, but we can get a little bit better of a timeline together on that. So we have that commitment to our families because, again, that's always been a piece. They have those now, but we wanted to add that information, and they have to sign off. I feel confident in the permission piece for that. And then, as you said, educating our families continuously around that, but then giving them a little bit broader info. We'll have that out the door before they even sign off on those, before any book clubs are launched. So
Points.
that makes me feel good knowing that I'm giving them, you know, more information around that before they're making that selection.
Melanie.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, would it make more sense to bring this policy for a vote after our group work session?
Most likely, Chris and I, when we build our agendas, we'll be looking at the timing of the work session, what the outcome is, and when and where it falls. So there's no dire need, right? We're under our current policy and have our current things, and we've made that public commitment around what we're bringing forward in those. So we have kind of that piece of time on our side to work that through.
Okay.
Thank you. Other thoughts, comments? All right, so I think that concludes, correct me if I'm wrong, Superintendent Wimmer, the policies for second reading.
Correct.
All right, we will then move on to action items. I'm just going to pause for a second just to double check, Dr. Temez, that you're here, as we will be taking action on these items, and I'll be doing a bunch of roll calls. Dr. Temez, are you still on the call?
Yep, still here.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, the next under action items is 2023-2024 staff compensation, and we have Mr. Lenny Hansen here to walk us through these items. Good evening.
Good evening. So we are here today to talk about several components of staff compensation, but not all of the pieces. So we'll talk about what we've got that is being brought forward today, as well as what we will foreshadow coming forward hopefully very soon. So annually, it comes before the board to discuss compensation, pay increases, wage scales, starting rates, all of those sorts of items. So that's what we're beginning the process of today. What we have today are several different employee groups, but not all of our employee groups. So one of the biggest pieces of staff compensation is certified staff, or sometimes the teaching staff, more commonly known as. So with teaching staff, there are certain components of their compensation that is part of the statutorily required negotiations process, and then other components that are not. So we are really eager very soon to begin negotiations with the WBA Teachers Union. We reached out back July 11th, and they sent us some dates that they are able to begin meeting with us. So we anticipate in the next week or two being able to sit down with them finally and begin that negotiation process. And we're very excited to do so. So once that process comes to its conclusion, you would see brought before you then teacher across the board compensation recommendations and so forth. That being said, there are components of teacher compensation that we are able to talk about this evening, and I'll get into those, as well as we're talking about support staff compensation, athletic workers, coaches, co-curricular advisors, whole sorts of different groups. So as we've talked about many times, the school district employs a lot of different people in a lot of different roles, so we kind of go through each of those individually. So within board docs, you'll see several different attachments that kind of all together compile to form what the recommendation is for today. So with compensation, we're excited to bring this forth here in mid-August, ahead of where the school year starts. Certainly our 12-month staff have already started their new fiscal year, so some of these pieces around 12-month staff would be retroactive to July 1st when the fiscal year begins. But if the board takes action to approve this today, we would be able to tell all of those school year staff what their compensation is before the school year starts, which is always nice. In some years, we're able to bring this forward earlier so that it even comes before the turn of the fiscal year. But as we talked about many times throughout the preceding months, we were really watching what the state budget situation, how that would unfold and so forth. So that brings us to the timeline where we are today. There's a lot of different factors that play into the recommendation around compensation. So we're always looking at what are trends in the labor market, what are inflationary pressures on wages that we see taking place, and we also conduct market analysis where we look at positions that have private sector comparables, because we know we're competing with the private sector for many different types of positions we have, as well as looking at information that's available from other school districts through DPI databases and so forth, so that we can maintain competitiveness with all of our regional neighbors as well. So there's a lot that goes into determining what the recommendation is. Today, I'm going to go through now kind of each component that you'll see there that kind of all together comes together to form the recommendation for today. So you will see support staff compensation and an across the board increase of 6% for support staff. You will also see across the board increases around athletic coaches, co-curricular advisors. You'll also see that we make recommendations around some of the starting pay or scales. So each year we bring those starting pay scales to the board, really just kind of resetting. Sometimes they change from one year to the next, sometimes they stay the same, but it's that opportunity for the board and the community to see each year what are the kind of starting wages for each position that the district has. We tend to try to increase the starting wages a small amount each year to avoid having to do kind of a large catch-up when we fall behind after a few years in terms of market competitiveness. So it's pretty common for us to see those starting wages increase from year to year. On the teaching staff side, you'll see something called expertise pays, an expertise pay chart. And that is presented today for approval. That is related to the certified staff or teaching staff compensation model. So if you recall, with our certified staff compensation model, we really like to acknowledge and recognize two different components of what our certified staff bring forward to the district and our students. So we really value longevity, staff who return each year, and that's where those across the board pay increases that come out of that negotiation process come forward. But we also highly value expertise, additional certification, additional licensure, higher education that's impactful to students. So we value really both of those longevity pieces as well as the expertise pays. On the expertise pays, we recognize those in the form of stipends that are paid each year added on to teacher salary. This approach has been in place for many years in the district and then really expanded upon in the compensation model that was approved in 2020. Each year, we tend to increase what those stipend amounts are to continue to keep pace with inflationary pressures. We also have a process where staff can submit each year suggestions for new items that are worth investigating whether they should be added to that list. And in fact, several new items that are added this year were suggested by staff that led to an analysis that took place between the Human Resources Department and the Teaching and Learning departments so that we could analyze, okay, how will these suggestions make a significant impact on student learning? And the ones where we're able to really define that, we then bring forward to add. So it started years ago as a short list, but now you see it's a very long list of all these really valuable pieces of expertise that the district really wants to recognize and reward with compensation. So you'll see that chart in there as well. You will also see things like the substitute pay each year is reviewed around this time as we're getting ready for the school year. We're also, in addition to, as Ms. Wimmer talked about, recruiting teachers to fill those last few vacancies, we're also recruiting substitutes, so ensuring that we continually keep pace with where substitute pay is very important, especially this time of year as all districts are out there looking for substitutes. Also, you will see a document called a support staff compensation model. That document is a new document to present to the board. It really mirrors what our certified staff compensation model is and looks to take the district kind of the next step in terms of employee compensation. For several years, as I said, the district has been recognizing on the teaching staff side of things both longevity with the district as well as those additional expertises. We've had a lot of staff come to us in the years since that model was approved saying, hey, we're in the support staff group, maybe paraprofessionals or professional technical or clerical staff who say, you know, we would love to have similar opportunities. We want to grow our learning. We view ourselves as being long-term employees here and want to grow our expertise. We'd love to have similar opportunities to grow our compensation through the pursuit of continuing education. The compensation model you see before you is really a first step in taking us down that road, where it really just sets the framework for how such a model would operate. And if you were to look at that document next to the teaching, the certified staff document, you'd see they're very, very similar, right? Because if we have a philosophy around compensation as an organization, really shouldn't be largely different from one group of employees to the other, right? So this document creates a great level of consistency across the system now for how we look at compensating all employees. As we, if the board takes action to approve that as part of this package of recommendations today, the next step then would be for us to develop a menu of options similar to what you see with the expertise pay chart for teachers, a similar menu of options that would be available to support staff. That's going to be a undertaking that takes some time, as we have a lot of different types of support staff employees. People think about paraprofessionals, you've got school secretarial staff, clerical, but you also have information technology staff and finance staff and facility staff, right? So we have a lot of different groups. We want to make sure that we're providing pathways for all of our different employees to be able to take advantage of such an opportunity. So that would really be the next step. If the board takes action to approve, that would be us to then develop that menu for support staff. So we're excited to bring that forward. It's been something that a lot of support staff have discussed with us, and we're finally able to bring that forward for a recommendation. That kind of comprises all of those documents you see. Again, we're really looking forward to the opportunity to sit down with the WBEA in the coming weeks to talk about kind of teacher across the board compensation. We're really thinking that's going to be a very fruitful negotiation process. We're eager to sit down. Once that process comes to completion, we would bring that forward. And then administrator compensation always comes kind of towards the end of this process as well. So you'd see that down the road as well. So whole lot of information there that I threw at you, but hopefully have kind of painted a picture of all those items that you see in board docs. So I'm happy to answer questions. And then from there, you know, the administration's recommendation would be to approve the totality of all these compensation items for 2023, 2024 altogether.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Hanson. Questions? Thoughts? Kurt, go for it.
Okay, I'll go first. I've been on the board 5 years. I personally am going to be in favor and voting yes for this. If you look at the last even just 5 years, this raise that we're talking about for these people involved are probably equal to the last 5 years' raises, roughly. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Maybe three, but
Maybe
yeah.
three?
Yeah, it's sizable. I mean, we're no stranger to the pressures that have been on wages and the labor market. And we are in competition not just with other school districts, but with the private sector, particularly on a lot of these employee groups they're talking about today. It's critical if we're going to continue to fill the positions and be in a decent position, as Ms. Wimmer talked about, in terms of our minimal number of vacant positions. It's critical that we maintain that competition.
Yeah, and then just a couple other comments. How we've been able to afford this raise and what we're talking is we've reduced our debt down to zero as a district. We will have no added interest expense or debt expense this next year. This is a balanced budget we're going forward with. We've also been very conscious, not only this board, previous boards, of right-sizing the district for decline in enrollment that we've been unfortunately occurring. So it's allowed us to not only balance the budget, but try to come as close as we can to the CPI. So I'm proud of even past boards and the administration. And I wish we got 2 weeks and a day before the start of the 29th, so maybe we can hammer out some negotiations with the teachers. I wish they would have come forward in July. I think we could have been there by now. That's me personally, just saying that. So look forward to that, and I'm voting in favor of it. And I'm proud to give our hardworking people some raises. And
Yeah, you said it beautifully. The other piece I would add is that this continues to tie into the pieces we talked about earlier this year around long-term total compensation strategy of really emphasizing wages. When you think about that wages benefits balance, right? The labor market is more and more heavily emphasizing wages, and that's what we're trying to do as well. And we're really eager to sit down with the teachers as well. It takes some time to put together the data and proposals and so forth. So we're glad that they're going to be ready, we believe, next week. And we think, again, we're going to have some really fruitful discussions.
Yeah.
John?
I'd just like to add, I mean, just knowing some of the work you guys have put in for, making sure we're doing our due diligence on other plans, if it's healthcare, whatever it is, to make sure we're getting the most in the pockets of these people. And most importantly, fitting it in the budget. I think that's, this is a sizable wage increase and hopefully should be a nice morale booster to the start of the year, so.
Fitting in
I'll
the
be in
budget
favor.
is a really important point because we feel really confident about the not just this year's budget, but future years' budgets as we build this. You'll see some things out there right now where school districts who are not as well positioned are talking about dipping into their fund balances and their reserves in order to just, address wages for the coming year. And we're nowhere close to any kind of situation like that because of the due diligence and the hard work that we've done. So, we're glad to be able to say this also fits within a really responsible budget.
Other thoughts? I would say a 6% increase, given inflationary pressures, seems very, very reasonable. What I appreciate also is it's not just a carte blanche 6%, but instead, you talked about the benchmarking, so that to make sure that, the positions are right size. So I think between those 2 points, I also am in favor of this. I think this is well reasoned and appreciate your and your staff's work on this. Other thoughts? This is an action item. I'll advance this to the table by making a motion to approve the staff compensation increases as presented. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you, Kurt. Motion and second to approve the staff compensation increases as presented. Any final discussion? Almost forgot the roll. I will now take the roll. Mr. Donaldson?
Yes.
Ms. Kruger? Yes. Mr. Swigert votes yes. Mr. Rebholz?
Yes.
Dr. Temez?
Yes.
Ms. Lang?
Yes.
And Ms. Aragon?
Yes.
Thank you. That motion passes unanimously. We appreciate your work.
Thank you.
We move to the next agenda item, which is the Student Family Handbook.
So recall that I had presented a draft of that, had everyone take another look. We had some new items, we had fleshed out some of the behavior pieces, so just bringing it back to the board for formal approval. In the interim, just some feedback on some minor cleanup of typos, et cetera. There was one piece, actually June, if you don't mind, I'm gonna just call attention to that. She was talking about kind of the evolution of technology and things like ChatGPT and all of that, and should we be nesting some language in around plagiarism? And I talked to Tim Harder, technology, around that, and just went, you know what, we got to explore that a little bit, because there's going to be, you know, where do you draw the line on predictive software? Where do you draw the line on some of this? How might we need to use those tools or teach kids to use those tools responsibly, and not all of that? So we'd like to flesh that out a little bit and bring that concept back to curriculum and how it is and isn't used responsibly for kids, kind of as we do that. So not present in the handbook, but as we kind of evolve that topic. Right now, we're leaving it as teachers really need to have conversations with students in their class around expectations, because they might be leading them to that and say, check this out, try this, how would it do this? How isn't it, you know, the best tool to write something? So we've got that covered. But other than that, just like to get this in the hands of our families as they look forward to starting the school year.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, June, for that suggestion. That'll be an interesting follow-up item. Any questions or comments or concerns about the Student Family Handbook? I would move then to approve the Student Family Handbook as presented. Is there a second?
Second. Melanie.
We'll give
Say,
Melanie
give that
that
one to Melanie.
Melanie gets that one. It was a close call. Thank you for the second, Melanie. Motion and second to approve the Student Family Handbook as presented. Any final discussion? Hearing none, I will call the roll. Ms. Aragon?
Yes.
Ms. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Rebholz?
Yes.
Mr. Donaldson?
Yes.
Ms. Kruger? Yes. Dr. Temez?
Yes.
And Mr. Swigert votes yes. That motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Superintendent Wimmer. We move then to the 2023-2024 assessment calendar.
Also, no changes previously presented from the last time we discussed the concept. There's some changes around the pre-ACT that came from the assessment committee that were talked about and brought forward. Again, all the assessment pieces, the calendar will be presented. We'll add this update into the family handbook. I think it gives a nice view of kind of when those will occur, not just that they do occur for our families as they schedule pieces, but we look forward to that integration of the new pre-ACT. I think that will be really helpful.
Any questions from the board? Just checking my notes. This is an action item, correct?
Correct.
Do we have a makeup schedules in here?
We don't have that. We'll do the individual, so they have a large window.
Is
And
this kind of
then,
case by case, or?
yep, and
Okay.
then each school will communicate kind of its exact testing schedule, what days for your kids at the different grades, and then, of course, the makeups and those opportunities. So good question.
Now-
We'll make sure and add that kind of at the end of the chart in the handbook.
Now, I know some of these testings, you know, some of the tests aren't well-liked across the student body, and specifically, some that aren't really like the STAR stuff. Do we have an optional retake if students, let's say, don't do well and then are placed in some kind of, you know,
Sure,
What's it
like
called?
course selection.
intervention,
Yeah,
that's the word I'm
yeah.
looking for.
So, good question. So we don't rely on just a singular point of data, because that teacher observation, other test performance, everyone can have an off day. So they can, in like the STAR test, they can be sensitive to, you know, this one's sick, that one went home with a fever, like I need to relaunch that, those kinds of things, and can do that. But they can't kind of go in and kind of chase a next higher score, so to speak. But teachers know their students and can kind of work with them on if it's not optimal day, or there needs to be a makeup, or we need to wait a little bit before we give that. So there's some good checks and balances, like you said, where it's not this just one definitive point. And I would be remiss too if I didn't just call out for the public that there's opt-out pieces, especially with the state testing, the Wisconsin Forward exam. Certainly we have to hit participation windows, but I would just want to make sure and include that so parents know and understand. We communicate that when we're closer to the test, and here's the form, and here's how you do that too. So.
Other questions, thoughts? All right, as this is an action item, I'll advance this. I move to approve the 2023-2024 assessment calendar as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Kelly. Motion and second to approve the 23-24 assessment calendar as presented. Any final discussion? Hearing none, I will call the roll. Ms. Kruger?
Yes.
Mr. Swigert votes yes. Ms. Aragot?
Yes.
Mr. Donaldson?
Yes.
Mr. Rebholz?
Yes.
Dr. Temez?
Yes.
And Ms. Lang?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. All right, that concludes our action items. We're now into future agenda items in the board meeting calendar. And I have a number of items here. We've got a busy next month or so. I think I'll take these by body. So the curriculum committee is scheduled to meet August 15, 4:30 p.m. at the Education Service Center, and September 19 at 4:30 p.m. at the Education Service Center. The Policy Committee is scheduled to meet on August 22nd and August 29th, both meetings starting at 4 p.m., both at the Education Service Center. We have a regular board meeting on August 28th and September 11th, both at 5:30 p.m. at the Education Service Center. And wedged in between, although I don't think we've necessarily officially finalized this, but it looks like, correct me if I'm wrong, individuals have responded that September 7th. One more? Okay, so we almost have a work session for the board scheduled. So I encourage, though, the public to view the official notices to make sure that these all happen at the time and place that I've indicated, but those are the plans for now. Any questions on the board calendar? And thank you in advance. We're going to be meeting quite a bit over the next month or so. But we have a lot of good work ahead of us, so I appreciate your efforts. We'll move then to items for follow-up and communication. Any items for follow-up and communication?
Maybe going back, September 7th does work for me, my enter button, obviously. And I was late, so it.
Thank you. September 7th,
That's right.
clearly.
All right, so it looks like the work session for the board is scheduled for September 7th, 4 p.m. here at the Education Service Center. Again, check the official notices in case there are changes to the place or time. All right, other items for follow-up and communication. All right, we've reached the end of our planned agenda. We do have a matter that is appropriate to discuss in executive session. So to comply with Wisconsin statutes, I will read the text. I make a motion to adjourn into executive session pursuant to Wisconsin Statute 19.851C to consider employment, promotion, compensation, or performance evaluation data of any public employee over which the governmental body has jurisdiction or exercises responsibility, and take any such action if necessary based on its discussion, namely compensation. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, John, for the second. So we have a motion and second to adjourn into executive session. Any final discussion? Hearing none, I will call the roll. Ms. Kruger?
Yes.
Mr. Swigert votes yes. Mr. Rebholz?
Yes.
Ms. Aragot?
Yes.
Mr. Donaldson?
Yes.
Dr. Temez?
Yes.
And Ms. Lang?
Yes.
That motion also carries unanimously. We are adjourned into executive session. Thank you for those attending in person and those who attended virtually. Have a good evening.